On this channel, we've really had a lot of times where we talk about the negative aspects of Helluva Boss, and to a lesser extent, Has-Been Hotel. The Helluverse is not the only content I produce, obviously, and contrary to what a lot of people may think, I personally do not believe the series is terrible. Hell, from an aesthetic perspective, I can really appreciate the artistic designs from both series, at least for the most part. But really the bigger issue I have with this series is obviously the writing in both of them, and while I've certainly had my fair share of people saying I don't know what I'm talking about or that I'm an idiot, which, fair enough I suppose, I still give my opinion here and there. And as such, let's talk about Mission Zero. For those unaware, Helluva Boss has finally been put onto the world of Amazon, joining the sister series Has-Been Hotel. And as such, a new episode was put out to act as an official prologue for it. Since, yeah, the pilot of Helluva Boss, especially in 2025, is extremely outdated, with not only the animation style, but with the obvious change in voice cast that was in the original pilot, and the script wasn't the greatest. It's also necessary to do since you're going to get a new audience brought to the series, and while the original pilot's canonicity was vague at best, despite what the creators may say, I'm not against there being a revamp of the pilot for a proper prologue. What I am against, however, is the prologue actively being used to cover up one of the biggest issues that the series has had. A series, mind you, that has been going on for at least half a decade at this point. So, I'm MangaKamen, and let's talk about it. One of the biggest complaints I've had on this channel when it comes to Helluva Boss, which I know most of my audience either loves to hear me complain about, or rather shove me into a wood chipper if I complained about this character again, but alas, here we go! Stolas. Now, I've got hours of content talking about Helluva Boss, and while I could probably just rehash all my issues with this character and how the writing does whatever it can to remove any sort of responsibility or culpability from his part of the relationship between him and Blitz, and you guys will probably watch that, which you have before, I know I'm not the only critic who has pointed this out. But one of the biggest issues has been brought up as how the show was in the first episode, Stolas had set up a deal with Blitz, while the imp was being shot at.
Anywho, I have been thinking. You know, I have been permitting you to access the mortal realm less than legally for some time now, but I do need it back to fulfill my duties. I was thinking, what if we worked out some kind of exchange? Favors for favors.
Hey!
Then let me keep it simple. Once a month, on the full moon, you return the book to me, followed by a night of passionate fornication. And you get to keep it all the rest of the time, Sound fair, my little imp?
And that's why there's been a bit of a vocal part of the critics who point this out because of this. Stolas comes off as abusing his power over Blitz, considering that he is a royal and Blitz is an imp, the lowest tier of creatures in hell. I could go in more detail about this, but that's basically the gist of the critique without having going to rehash things. But in Mission Zero...
Don't worry, I'll just be taking my grimoire and...
Or, how about this? You could let me hold on to it for a little while. Please? There's this one spell I have been wanting to try. Did I not just plow you on company time?
Oh, I suppose as long as you have it, we'll be sure to see each other again.
It essentially has Blitz put the deal on the table and not Stolas. Now, obvious contradictions aside with what happens in the official episode 1, I do not like this. I really do not like this, for obvious reasons. This decision pretty much takes a lot of the responsibility away from Stolas in the relationship between the two. And instead of Stolas, who I may remind you, is a demon, being a horrible person who realizes, oh shit, this kind of arrangement I made is kind of manipulative, and goes out of his way to improve from this. Even going so far as to get the Asmodean crystal so Blitz wouldn't be pressured to keep up with the deal he set so he can keep going to the human world for his own job. Blitz being the one to set this deal does take a fair bit of responsibility away from Stolas, since while the power imbalance is still there, it puts the onus on Blitz for setting this whole thing up. Now, the character Blitz, I still have a very conflicting opinion on him to this very day. I understand Blitz is one of those self-sabotaging characters who acts like a punching bag for the sake of the story, and to an extent, it does work. But it often feels like for the sake of sparing Stolas from any sort of responsibility, Blitz is often the guy set on fire more and more in this relationship. I've documented all of my issues with this over the course of the second season, which, hey, there's also a funny little contradiction that also cropped up with this new revamped prologue, and unironically gives me more of a reason to dislike the owl, if you can believe it. So, in Apology Tour and continuing in Full Moon, one of the biggest arguments that Stolas delivers against Blitz is that Stolas can't believe that Blitz would only see the relationship they had as transactional and about sex.
I have wanted you for so long. The fact that you couldn't believe that I might have these feelings about you, that your first instinct is that it's always about sex.
Oh gee, I wonder where Blitz could ever get that idea that your relationship was only about the physical and transactional. Whoever could have seen that coming other than the fact that Blitz outright told you to your face.
Cuddle?
Solus, don't act like what we have is anything but you wanting me to fuck you, okay? You make that really clear all the time.
Like, I'm really not trying to make Visipop and the writing staff that her shows are on to be the worst things ever done in the world, because they're not. But the revamped pilot here was meant to be more in line with the show, since you've got old fossils like me complaining about the changes that were made from the pilot to the main show, fixing the portrayals of the characters. Really though, this revamped pilot only succeeded in doubling down on what the pilot was, only with more gay demon owl sex, which is a phrase I thought I wouldn't be saying on my YouTube channel, but I'm only surprised it only took this long now. Now, we need to talk about the narrative tool, the retcon, in order to explain why I think this is bad. Time to talk about retcons! Retcons are a writing tool that you'll sometimes see in media, otherwise known as retroactive continuity. It's a rather contentious technique. If you don't know what a retcon is, it's effectively when a writer takes something that is a concrete, established fact of the world or story they're making, and they add new context, i.e. the retcon, and it gives a radically new meaning or contradicts the previously established facts. This typically happens in more long-form media, but it can obviously happen in shorter stories too. Now, I want to make it clear, retcons are not inherently bad. Much like how every literary tool or trope, it's dependent on how it's used. Let me give two examples of retcons, and I'm using things that aren't straight up spoilers, but just to be on the safe side, spoilers for the Pokemon games, franchise, and One Piece. I'll have a chapter getting past that here, but you've been warned properly. Back in the original first two generations of Pokemon, Red, Blue, Yellow, Gold, Silver, and Crystal, the two regions Kanto and Johto were effectively more technologically advanced mirrors of the actual Japanese regions they're named after. And because of that, you'll find a lot of references to the real world. Some of the more prominent ones are how Lieutenant Surge, the third gym leader of the first games, being specifically listed as the American Soldier, known as the Lightning American. The 151st Pokemon, Mew, was said to be discovered in the South American country of Guyana, and there are countless other Pokedex entries that bring up the real world and actual real world animals. And one of my more personal favorite examples comes from the first movie.
I didn't know Vikings still existed!
They mostly live in Minnesota!
But eventually, these things changed, and you may be wondering why.
Why?
Well, it's for the sake of creative freedom. You have to remember that Game Freak initially thought that they wouldn't be able to get their first game off the shelf, and there was talks about how the series was supposed to end in Generation 2. However, thanks to the ever-increasing popularity of the series, which we're still getting a new game every few years now, that plan was scrapped. And with the need there being of new Pokemon to be introduced, and there being new regions to be created, the real world ultimately couldn't keep up with the creative choices with the franchise. And then there's One Piece, with the retcon being hockey. Now, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a few people in the comments who are going to say that hockey isn't a retcon, and will point to a few scenes in the story where there are things like hockey shown well before the Skypiea arc, such as Shanks saving Luffy from a monster in the sea. Look, I'm already getting comments about how people are complaining about me protesting about the sexy owl being made into a worse hypocrite. At least take it to mean I didn't say Frankie was a useless character. But let's just say, for the sake of my argument, that hockey is a retcon. It's a good retcon, because if we consider the Devil Fruit power system, there would be no real way for some characters to be defeated. One of the prominent examples of this is in the early part of the story, Logtown, where the boy who can stretch his arms with brain damage, Monkey D. Luffy, comes across a Marine officer named Smoker, who has the ability to turn his entire body into smoke, and no matter how much Luffy punches and kicks, he can't effectively land an attack on the guy. And this was also replicated in the Alabasta arc when Luffy had to fight against Crocodile, who had the ability to turn his entire body into sand and can only counter it because of water. Now, you might as well just accept this as Pokemon logic, because you might as well use a fighting type move on a ghost type, since that ain't gonna land normally. So it makes it a near impossibility for our protagonist to be able to defeat any other opponent that is essentially a basic element. Like, say, off the top of my head, lightning. The only reason that Luffy was able to defeat an opponent like Eneru or Enel was because he was lucky to be made out of rubber.
Stay calm. Physical attacks still can't affect my body. He's just a helpless monkey from the Blue Sea world.
Though obviously not every enemy could be defeated like that. So, with the introduction of hockey, which is essentially spiritual energy, it gave characters the ability to actually fight against the more impossibly based foes. It was a retcon that would help cover the issues that the initial power system had. Now, I bring these up to showcase not all retcons in fiction are inherently bad, but that doesn't mean that there aren't bad retcons. Hell, remember what this video was actually about? Helluva Boss, Mission Zero. Yeah, I know it's been about 1,000 years since we switched topics, but I did have a point going here. And that's, to me, this is probably the worst way you could use the retcon. It's an attempt to fix a critique that a lot of people have commented on, and while I will applaud the attempt, a retcon isn't really the right tool to solve the issue. The problem with this sort of retcon in Helluva Boss is that it fails to understand what actually needed to be fixed. Because, and I can only speak to my own opinions on the matter, the real issue was that it felt like Blitz was being the only character in the relationship to be facing consequences for his choices in said relationship. Meanwhile, Stolas really wasn't. Hell, in Apology Tour, the musical number effectively quashes any sort of part he may have had in bungling the relationship. That isn't to say that the character wasn't salvageable, and there were steps being taken that Stolas would eventually realize the flaws that his own character and try to improve from that. It's this magical thing called character development. This retcon tries to fix the character issue by putting it onto another character, and at the same time it makes Stolas out to be much more hypocritical. I'm not even sure how you do that on purpose. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't make this work. There is a way to do so. All you'd have to do is have Stolas see how frantic Blitz is when the bird tries to take the book back, and then Stolas tries to be kind to make an offer that maybe the two could come sort of deal. Although Stolas could be made hesitant about that since his book is important to his position, and if it got out that an imp was using his book, well, that could lead to some nasty problems. And that's all you'd have to do to make this work. It would still be on Stolas for using his position over Blitz, but you'd also added the fact that Stolas is a bit more understanding of Blitz's position, and trying at the very least to give the imp what he wants, but playing ball the way he does. You still have Stolas being in the wrong, but you also paint him in a much more favorable light, that he can at least understand Blitz's emotions to some level. I don't know, dreamers can dream I suppose, but whatever. Still, as far as things go, this doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, especially with Helluva Boss. Most people who have seen the revamped opening will more than likely only watch the first episode afterwards and go, wait, why is Stolas calling Blitz about their arrangement? Didn't they already do this? And for most people, that won't be a problem. It's entertainment. I personally do not like the direction that this retcon goes in, but it's not my series. I'm just a guy who gives his opinion online and is trying to make his own creative endeavors. And frankly, while this does contradict some of the later points in the series, ultimately this retcon kinda pales in comparison to the rest of the issues that the series have, in my opinion. With Season 3 on the horizon, I do wonder what's going to be done. But alas, only time will tell, and as I've stated, I haven't given up on the series. Not yet, anyway. I do believe that Helluva Boss still has a chance to turn things around and really make something beautiful. And while the path was rocky, I like to believe that there's some really good things done with the series. Hell, I've even talked about that multiple times on this channel. Though, again, if you ask anyone on the internet, they'll only point to the negative videos that I've made. That being said, what do you guys think of Mission Zero? Do you think that this retcon is a big deal or not? Let me know down in the comments below. I'm MangaKamen, and thanks for watching. Bye.